Will you dance with me? The small voice broke through the music and talking at Riverside Elementary School's gym, and everyone got quiet for a moment, surprised by what they heard. Near the snack table, a tall man in a gray sweater turned around quickly, almost dropping his cup of fruit punch. His name was David Carter, and he was super rich and famous for running a big company that made medical machines, but nobody expected him to be at a school dance, and they really didn't expect a 6-year-old girl to walk right up to him. The little girl wore a pretty yellow dress and held the edge nervously with her small hand. Her name was Sophie Mitchell, and her braids bounced when she nodded. "Yes," she said, "everyone else is dancing with their dads, and I don't have one, but you're standing all alone, so will you be my partner?" The people watching gasped softly, and teachers looked at each other with wide eyes. One parent whispered, "That's David Carter, the super famous David Carter," and another said, "Is she really asking him to dance?" David felt his face get hot because it had been so long since anyone looked at him without wanting something or thinking about his money. This little girl just saw someone who was left out, just like her. He almost said no, but then Sophie's face looked worried, and something inside his heart, something that had been sleeping for a long time, woke up. He put down his punch cup, smiled a little, and held out his hand. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess I better not say no to such an important invitation." Sophie grinned really big, showing the space where her front tooth used to be, and she grabbed his hand and pulled him to the middle of the dance floor. Everyone moved out of the way, making a circle around them, and the DJ, seeing what was happening, changed the song to a slow, happy one. David bent down a little to be closer to her height. "You'll have to show me what to do," he whispered. "Okay," Sophie said seriously, "just follow my feet." She stepped left, he stepped right, and their shoes bumped into each other. Sophie giggled, and David laughed nervously and tried again. They kept stepping on each other's toes and almost fell over, but the laughter from the people watching wasn't mean this time, it was warm and happy. Sophie laughed so hard she snorted, and David, who hadn't laughed like that in forever, started laughing too, a deep sound that filled the whole gym. Even though their dancing was clumsy and silly, they were having so much fun. "You're really bad at this," Sophie teased with a big smile. "I know," he said, trying to copy how she moved, "but you're really good at it." "I'm just pretending," she whispered proudly. "Then I'll pretend too," David said, and for the first time in a really long time, he felt like a regular person instead of just a rich businessman. When the song ended, everyone clapped really loud, and some parents even wiped tears from their eyes. The principal walked up to the microphone, smiling. "Well everyone," she said, "I think we just saw the most unexpected and heartwarming dance of the whole evening, and since they brought more smiles than anyone tonight, the judges decided to give them a special award." Sophie's mouth dropped open. "We won." David blinked, just as surprised. "We what?" The principal held up a small gold ribbon that said "Best Spirit of the Dance" on it. "Mr. David Carter and Miss Sophie Mitchell," she announced, and the gym cheered. David laughed and shook his head like he couldn't believe it, while Sophie jumped in the air, clapping her hands. She reached up, and he bent down so she could pin the ribbon to his sweater. "See," she said, "we make a good team." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I guess we do." Emma Mitchell, Sophie's mom, stood at the edge of the room still wearing her hospital nurse uniform because she came straight from work to pick up her daughter, and she couldn't believe her little girl had just danced with one of the richest men in America. For a long moment she didn't move, then David looked her way and gave her a polite nod, and she smiled back softly, a tired but real smile that said thank you. After everyone stopped clapping, Sophie tugged on David's sleeve. "Can we dance again next year?" He thought for a second, then bent down beside her. "Only if you promise to teach me how not to step on your toes." "Deal," Sophie said. The principal called everyone over for group photos, and Sophie dragged David toward the paper stars and balloons they had set up. They smiled for the camera, David kneeling awkwardly beside her, both grinning really wide. The camera flash caught the sparkle in her eyes and the peaceful but tired look on his face. Later that night, as he drove home through the quiet streets of the city, David couldn't stop smiling. The gold ribbon still hung crookedly on his sweater, catching the light from his car's dashboard. He looked at it and shook his head. Best spirit of the dance, he said to himself, not bad for a man who can't dance. At his house by the lake, he hung up his coat and sat by the fireplace. His home was so quiet, with no laughter and no music. He looked at the picture frame on the table, a photo of his wife and daughter who had died in a car accident years ago, and he touched the glass gently. You would have loved her, he whispered. He opened his old leather notebook and wrote, February 14th, danced with a little girl named Sophie Mitchell. We were terrible dancers but we laughed anyway. She gave me a ribbon that's worth more than any award I've ever gotten. He closed the book and looked out the window at the moon shining on the lake, and somewhere inside him, something heavy finally felt lighter. As he fell asleep, the words played in his mind again, soft and sweet. Will you be my dance partner? He smiled a little in the dark. Yes, Sophie, he whispered, anytime. The next morning, sunlight came through the tall windows of David's house by the lake, shining on the gold ribbon that was still pinned to his gray sweater laying on a chair. He poured himself a cup of coffee, and for a long time he just stood there looking out at the lake. The water sparkled like glass, and little waves caught the reflection of the pine trees along the shore. He felt strangely light, like some heavy weight had been lifted during that dance. The night before kept replaying in his mind, the laughter, the clumsy steps, the little girl's fearless smile. He could still hear her voice, clear and bright. Will you be my dance partner? David chuckled to himself. You got me good, kid, he said quietly. On his kitchen counter, his phone was buzzing over and over with notifications. He hadn't looked at it yet, but all those messages told him something was happening. He finally picked it up and saw headlines filling the screen. Rich man David Carter dances with little girl at school event, heartwarming moment. Goes everywhere on the internet. His email was full of reporters asking for statements, his assistant asking if he wanted to say something, and his work people texting, Sir, this is all over the news, do you want to make a comment? He sighed because the world always wanted a story, even from something that wasn't supposed to be one. He set the phone down, picked up his coffee cup, and stepped outside onto his porch. The morning was cool and crisp, and somewhere across the lake, ducks were swimming on the water. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to answer to anyone or explain anything. He just wanted quiet, but he couldn't help wondering what Sophie and her mother thought about all this. Back in the city, at the small apartment where they lived, Emma Mitchell had seen the picture too. Her phone had practically exploded with messages from people she worked with at the hospital. Emma, is this your daughter? That's Sophie, right? You guys are famous. She stared at her phone in shock. The picture was everywhere, showing her little girl laughing with one of the richest men in America. It didn't make sense. She remembered him from the night before, how his face turned red when Sophie asked him to dance, how he bent down just to match her height. There was something really human about it, and he didn't look like a super rich person then, he just looked like a lonely man trying to remember how to smile. Sophie didn't know about any of the fuss and was sitting at the kitchen table drawing in her notebook. Mom, can I bring my ribbon for show and tell? Emma said gently, Sweetheart, maybe we shouldn't talk too much about that at school because Mr. Carter is kind of famous. Sophie looked up. I know, my teacher said he's a big boss of something, but he's nice and he laughed at my jokes. Emma smiled a little. Yes, he did. Sophie leaned closer and whispered like it was a secret. Do you think he'll come back? Emma wasn't sure what to say. I don't know, honey, but even as she said it, a small part of her hoped he would. At that same moment, David sat in his office downtown for the first time in months. The city's tall buildings stretched beyond the windows, shining like mirrors. He hadn't been here since he stopped being the boss of his company and let younger people run it instead. The person at the front desk stared as he walked past, and whispers followed him like shadows. He's back, did you see the photo, the one with the girl, maybe he's trying to look better. He ignored them because he was here for one reason, to sign papers for money he promised to give to the local hospital months ago. On the paperwork, he saw the name Emma Mitchell written as nurse helper. He tapped his pen against the page, remembering her tired but kind smile from the dance. Later that afternoon, he drove to the hospital. The automatic doors opened with a whoosh, and he could smell medicine and coffee. He walked up to the front desk. "I'm looking for Nurse Mitchell," he said. The young person at the desk's eyes got really wide when they recognized him. "Yes, sir, she's in the children's area." David nodded thanks and followed the signs. He found Emma near some hospital beds, helping a small boy with his medicine tube. When she turned around, surprise showed on her face. "Mr. Carter," she said. "David," he said softly, "just call me David, and I wanted to bring something in person." He handed her an envelope with the hospital's seal on it. Inside was a check, his promised donation, but it was 5 times bigger than what he first said. She blinked. "This is too much." "It's not enough," he said quietly, "you and your team do work that actually matters." She looked at his face carefully, not sure what to say. "You didn't have to come here yourself." He smiled a little. "I owed someone a promise." "Sophie," she guessed. He nodded. "She said we'll dance again next year, and I plan to keep my word." Emma laughed softly, a gentle and surprised sound. "She hasn't stopped talking about you since last night. You made quite an impression on her." "She made one on me too," he said. "Your daughter reminded me of something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" Emma asked. "That kindness doesn't care who's watching," David said. Emma's face softened. "She has that effect on people." "So I've noticed," he replied. For a moment they stood in comfortable silence, with the hallway lights shining on the clean floor and the distant beep of hospital machines filling the air. "How is she?" he asked finally. "Excited, curious, totally convinced you're secretly a superhero," Emma said. "I'm afraid she's wrong," he said smiling. "She's not," Emma replied. "Superheroes don't always wear capes." David looked down, suddenly not sure what to do with his hands. "I'm sorry if all the attention caused trouble. The last thing I wanted was to make your life harder." Emma shook her head. "You didn't, people are just surprised. They don't expect someone like you to show up at a school dance." "Neither did I," he said, "but I'm glad I did." She held the envelope under her arm. "Well, Mr. David, thank you, truly." He nodded, then stopped before leaving. "Tell Sophie I said hello and that I'll be practicing my dance moves." Emma laughed again, a sound that made the hospital hallway feel warmer. "I'll tell her, but don't say I didn't warn you, she'll hold you to that promise." He smiled, gave a small wave, and walked back toward the exit. Outside, the winter sun was going down behind the city's buildings. For once, David didn't feel the usual loneliness that followed him everywhere. Something about that hospital, about that little girl's honest joy, had made his sadness feel softer. When he got to his car, he looked back at the building one more time. He thought about Sophie's laughter, about Emma's steady calmness, and he realized he wanted to keep seeing them, not because he had to, not like charity work, but because they made the world feel real again. As he drove away, the evening light spilled gold across the road, and on the radio, by chance or maybe magic, that same slow happy song began to play again. David smiled to himself and turned up the volume. He wasn't a good dancer yet, but maybe, just maybe, he was learning the steps again. David went back to his house by the lake later that evening, his mind feeling restless in a strange way. The fire in the fireplace had burned low, but he didn't light it again. He just sat down with his coat still on, listening to the sound of crickets outside and the song still playing in his thoughts. He hadn't planned to see Emma that day and didn't expect the pull of feelings that came with it. Something about her calm strength had made him feel unsettled in a good way. For the first time in years, talking to someone felt human, not about business or his company or power, just real life. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, but then a memory came to him, his own daughter Lily, laughing as she stood barefoot in their old kitchen, making him dance to that same song. "You're too stiff, Daddy," she'd said giggling, "you have to feel the music." He had felt it once, until the car accident took her and her mother away. David opened his eyes and let out a shaky breath. Maybe, he thought, Sophie was the universe's way of reminding him that joy still existed, that even sadness had to make room for life eventually. The next morning as he drank his coffee, his phone buzzed again with a text from a number he didn't know. "Hi Mr. David, it's Sophie's mom Emma, I hope this is okay. Sophie wanted me to tell you she practiced dancing again today and she says you need to catch up. David stared at the message for a long moment, then smiled. He typed back, then I better start practicing, tell her I'll see her soon, and he paused then added, and thank you for letting her remind me how to smile again. He wasn't sure if he should send something so personal, but it was honest. A few minutes later his phone buzzed again. She says you smiled just fine the first time. David laughed out loud and shook his head. Smart kid, he said to himself. That Saturday, David showed up at Riverside Elementary with a quiet plan. He had called the school board privately and offered to pay for fixing up the whole playground. The slides were cracked, the swings were rusty, and the grass was patchy and bare, but he didn't want plaques with his name or people making a big deal about it. He just wanted the kids, especially Sophie, to have a nice place to play. The school principal Mrs. Howard almost fainted when he walked into her office. Mr. Carter, this is incredibly generous, she said nervously. Are you sure you want it to be anonymous? The parents would love to thank you. I'm sure, he said simply, this isn't about me. She looked at him for a moment then nodded. Then at least let me tell the staff that an angel's watching over Riverside. Please don't, he said with a soft smile, just tell them someone still believes in playgrounds. That afternoon as he left the school, he saw Emma standing by the parking lot with a grocery bag in one hand and her nurse badge still clipped to her jacket. When she saw him, her face lit up with surprise. You again, she said smiling, you have a habit of showing up in unexpected places. It's what I do, he said lightly, I go where people are kind. Well, you picked the right school, she replied, except for the coffee in the teacher's lounge, that's terrible. He laughed and it felt easy, and for a while they talked like old friends about the weather, about her long work shifts, about how Sophie was teaching herself to read a book about a spider and a pig. When Emma mentioned that the school was trying to raise money for a new playground, David almost smiled. Funny, he said, I think that might take care of itself. Really, you think so? She asked, not catching the hint. I have a good feeling, he said. Then Sophie appeared, running across the field with her backpack bouncing. Mr. David, she yelled. He bent down automatically, catching her as she jumped into his arms, and she smelled like crayons and bubble gum. Hey dance champion, he said, practicing your moves? She nodded really hard. I've been spinning, Mom says I look like a tornado. I'll need to practice twice as hard then, he said, I don't want to lose to a tornado. Emma smiled at the two of them, the sight both beautiful and a little sad because she hadn't seen anyone make her daughter that happy in years. David walked them to their car, and as Emma helped Sophie get buckled in, he leaned against the door. I wanted to ask, he said quietly, would you and Sophie like to come to the lake sometime? It's quiet with good air and she can feed the ducks, nothing fancy I promise. Emma looked unsure. You really don't have to. I know, he said gently, but I'd like to. She thought for a second then smiled. All right, she'd love that, and so would I. On Sunday the three of them met at David's house by the lake. The water sparkled in the afternoon light and the air was cool but soft. Sophie ran to the water's edge, throwing breadcrumbs and squealing as ducks splashed closer. They like me, she shouted. They like the bread, David called back chuckling, but I'll pretend it's you. Emma watched them with her arms folded, her laughter mixing with his. Inside Emma had brought sandwiches and apple pie, saying she was raised to never show up without food. You didn't have to cook, David said. You invited us, I couldn't come empty-handed, she replied. They sat on the porch eating together as the afternoon sun got lower, and for a long time there were no heavy words or tension, just easy talking, the kind people forget how to have. When Sophie fell asleep in a deck chair, Emma turned to David quietly. You really do like her, she said, I see it in your eyes. She reminds me of someone, he said, my daughter Lily. Emma didn't speak right away. I'm sorry, she said softly. It was a long time ago, he said quietly, but last night with Sophie, for the first time it didn't hurt as much to remember her. Emma looked at him with something tender in her eyes. Maybe that's how healing works, she said, you can't force it, sometimes it just walks up to you and asks will you be my dance partner. David smiled, quiet and grateful, and the wind rustled the lake surface. For a while they just sat there listening to the water, and he hadn't realized how much he'd missed the sound of another person simply breathing beside him. When the sun went down below the trees, Emma gathered her things. "We should go before she wakes up and begs to stay forever," she said. "You'd be surprised," David replied, "I might let her." She smiled, shook her head, and lifted her sleeping daughter into her arms. As they walked to the car, David watched them go, feeling something strange in his chest, something that felt a lot like hope. That night when he went back inside, he saw the little gold ribbon still hanging on the shelf where he'd left it. He touched it gently and whispered, "Looks like we're both learning to dance again, Lily." A week went by before David saw Sophie and Emma again, but their laughter stayed in his thoughts like it had become part of his house. Each morning while drinking his coffee and watching the lake's calm water, he found himself smiling without knowing it. It had been years since he started the day with something other than silence. The photo of Sophie and him at the school dance was still going around online, though the craziness had started to quiet down as people moved on to new stories. But for David, that night stayed like a living picture in his mind, warm, bright, perfect. He had gone back to the world of offices and business calls, but even there he caught himself humming that happy song under his breath. The difference between his cold office and the little girl's laughter was so crazy that he began to wonder which of the two worlds was real. By Thursday afternoon his phone buzzed with a name he now knew. Emma Mitchell. He smiled, standing up as he answered. "Hey stranger," Emma's voice teased, "you've been busy." "Trying to learn what a bush trimmer does," he said, looking at the uneven line he'd cut. "So far the bushes are winning." She laughed. "Well, Sophie's been asking for you every day. She's been working on something she wants to show you. Something artistic, I hope, because my fridge is running out of space for her drawings." Emma laughed softly. "Actually, it's more than a drawing. She's been writing you a letter, but she insists on reading it to you in person." David felt something warm spread in his chest. "Then I'd better come hear it." By noon he was knocking on their apartment door again. Sophie greeted him with the same wild excitement as always, jumping into his arms before he could even step inside. "Mr. David, I finished it," she said, waving a folded piece of paper covered in purple crayon hearts. "You did," he said smiling. "What's it about?" "Sit down first," she said seriously, "it's long." Emma shook her head laughing. "She's been rehearsing all morning." David sat on the couch as Sophie climbed onto the coffee table in front of him, clearing her throat dramatically. "Okay," she said, holding the paper up like she was on TV, "Dear Mr. David." Emma smiled and leaned against the kitchen counter as Sophie read out loud. "Dear Mr. David, thank you for being my dance partner even though you're bad at spinning. Thank you for brownies and for feeding ducks and for teaching Mom how to laugh again. I like when you visit because the house feels bigger when you're here. Mom says people can't fix everything, but I think maybe they can fix something. You fixed our hearts a little bit. Love, Sophie." David couldn't speak. The room was quiet except for the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and he looked down at the little girl standing proudly in front of him and his throat felt tight. "Sophie," he said softly, "that's the best letter I've ever gotten." She grinned. "You're going to cry, aren't you?" He laughed, but his eyes were wet. "Maybe a little." Emma walked over and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "That was beautiful, sweetheart." Sophie handed the letter to David. "Now it's yours and you have to keep it forever." "I promise," he said. After Sophie ran off to her room to play, Emma stayed near the couch. "You okay?" she asked gently. He looked up at her with bright eyes. "I don't know how to explain it, Emma. She makes everything feel simple again and I didn't realize how much I missed that." Emma smiled softly. "Sophie has that effect on people. She doesn't know much about the world yet, so she just chooses the parts she wants to believe in." "And she believes in me?" he asked quietly. "She does," Emma said, "and if I'm being honest, so do I." David met her eyes surprised. "You do?" "I see the way you look at her," she said, "like she's giving you back something you thought you lost. That's not something a selfish man does." He let out a slow breath, feeling grounded by her words. "I lost my way after Lily and my wife died. Everything turned gray. I tried to fill the space with work and money and everything that didn't matter. but since that dance, he shook his head with a small smile. It's like color came back. Emma reached out and touched his hand lightly. Maybe that's what love does, David. It doesn't erase the pain, it just reminds you there's still beauty left. He looked at her hand resting over his and felt the quiet strength in her touch. I haven't met many people who see the world that way. Then you've been spending time with the wrong people, she said softly. The sound of tiny footsteps interrupted them as Sophie came running and holding a plastic crown. Mom, Mr. David, we have to have another dance practice. David laughed. Right now? Yes, she said, Mom too. Emma blushed. Oh no, I don't dance. You do tonight, Sophie said, pushing the crown into her mother's hand. You can be Queen Mom and Mr. David's still the king. David stood up, offering Vanessa his hand with a playful smile. Your Majesty. She rolled her eyes but took his hand anyway. Just this. Once, she said quietly. Sophie played the happy song from her tiny speaker and the melody filled the apartment. The three of them moved together, laughter spilling between the notes as Sophie twirled between them, clumsy and joyful, her giggles echoing through the room. At one point David caught Emma's eyes and there was something in them, something quiet and knowing, showing the same hope growing in his chest. For the briefest moment the rest of the world disappeared. When the song ended, Sophie bowed dramatically again. See, we're getting better. David smiled, still holding Emma's hand. We are, he said softly. After dinner, when he got ready to leave, Sophie wrapped her small arms around him. Don't forget the letter, she said, slipping it into his jacket pocket. If you ever feel sad, read it, okay? He nodded, his voice thick. I will, sweetheart, always. Outside the night air was cool, carrying the soft hum of city sounds. David leaned against his car for a moment, looking up at the stars barely visible above the streetlights. He pulled the letter from his pocket and unfolded it under the glow of a lamp post, the crayon hearts looking almost like they were shining. He smiled, and for the first time in years he didn't feel like a man haunted by loss. He felt like someone standing on the edge of something new, something fragile, something real, and though he didn't know where it would go, David knew one thing for certain: he wasn't dancing alone anymore. 2 months passed and spring had fully turned into summer. The air grew heavier with warmth and bugs hummed in the trees around the lake. David's days had settled into an unexpected rhythm, one that no business plan could have predicted. Mornings started with coffee on the porch and a phone call from Emma or Sophie. Sometimes it was a cheerful good morning, sometimes just a story about school or hospital work, and every call left him smiling. In the evenings he often drove into the city to meet them for ice cream or just to walk with Sophie through the park as she told him stories that never seemed to end. But something had started to shift beneath the surface, a quiet awareness especially between him and Emma. They laughed easily, finished each other's sentences without trying, and sometimes fell into silences that said more than words, yet neither dared to name what was growing there. One Sunday afternoon Emma and Sophie visited the lake house again. Sophie ran straight to the water chasing ducks and skipping stones, while Emma stayed near the porch watching David set out lemonade and sandwiches. You really like this place, she said softly. I used to hate it, he said, looking toward the lake. It felt too empty after Lily and her mother were gone. Every sound just reminded me of silence, but now it feels alive again. Emma smiled. Funny how that works, places don't change but people do. He looked at her. Maybe people help places heal. She met his eyes and didn't look away, and for a long fragile moment neither spoke. Then Sophie's voice broke the quiet. Mr. David, I found a baby duck. They both laughed, the spell broken, and walked down to the dock together. The little duckling was making sad noises in the shallow water, separated from its mother. Sophie bent down whispering softly. It's scared. David knelt beside her. Then we should help it find its way back. With slow movements he guided the duckling toward the plants where its mother waited, and the tiny creature paddled away joining its family again. Sophie clapped her hands. We did it. David smiled. We make a good team. Emma's voice was gentle. You've got a gift, you know, with her, with people. I don't think it's a gift, he said, I just started paying attention again. Later that evening, as the sun went down low and painted the sky orange, Emma helped David pack up the picnic basket while Sophie had fallen asleep on a blanket, curled up like a kitten. The world felt frozen in that soft light. "You know," Emma said quietly, "when I first met you I thought you'd disappear after that dance." He laughed. "You and everyone else." "But you didn't," she said, "you kept showing up." "For her, for us," he said, looking at the sleeping child, "I needed to." Emma studied his face. "What's that?" "Belonging," he said simply. "I thought I'd lost it forever." The honesty in his voice made her chest feel tight, and she reached out, brushing a leaf off his sleeve, a small gesture, but it lasted longer than it should have. "David," she said softly, "I know you're trying to build something new, but I need to ask, are you ready for what that means?" He looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" She waited. "You live in a world full of eyes, people who think they know who you are. Sophie and we're just ordinary, and I'm not sure how kind your world is to people like us." David nodded slowly. "I understand, you're worried about what people will say." "I'm worried about what it might do to Sophie," Emma said. "She's been through enough." He took a deep breath. "I can't promise the world will be kind, but I can promise I'll protect her, both of you, from as much of it as I can." Emma's eyes softened. "You don't have to save us, David." "I know," he said quietly, "maybe I just want to stand beside you while you save yourselves." The words hung between them, heavy and tender, and Emma looked away, blinking back emotion. When she finally spoke again, her voice was lighter. "You're better at words than dancing, you know." He grinned. "I'll take that as progress." As the evening got darker, he carried sleeping Sophie to the car while Emma gathered their things. The hum of crickets filled the air and the lake sparkled faintly in the moonlight. When he placed Sophie gently into her seat, she stirred, whispering, "You're coming next week, right?" "Always," he said, brushing hair from her face. Emma closed the car door softly and turned to him. "Good night, David." "Good night," he replied. She stopped for a moment, then leaned forward and kissed his cheek, soft, brief but real. "For the record," she said, smiling faintly, "you're not as bad at dancing as you think." He stood there as she drove away, his hand touching his cheek where her lips had brushed, and the sound of their laughter still echoed faintly in the night air. Inside, he sat down at his desk and opened his notebook. On the next blank page he wrote, "June 12th, they came to the lake today. Sophie found a lost duckling and Emma found a way into my heart." He closed the book, smiling to himself, and somewhere out there life was still full of loss and noise. And meanness, but here under the quiet stars there was something else, something small, fragile and fiercely good, and David Carter, the man who once thought love was a chapter closed forever, realized he was learning how to begin again. A week later the city air buzzed with summer heat, the kind that made everything feel soft, the buildings, the sounds, the steady movement of traffic. David's car rolled quietly through the narrow streets leading to Emma's apartment, and he'd come early without telling them, carrying a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was something that had taken him 3 weeks to make, a simple wooden jewelry box he'd carved by hand in his workshop by the lake. He'd sanded it himself, tracing every edge, and carved 2 small words on the lid, "For you." He hadn't built anything with his hands since his father died many years ago, but something about Emma and Sophie made him want to touch life again, not just pay for it. When he knocked, the door opened to the smell of pancakes and syrup, and Emma stood there barefoot with her hair tied loosely, wearing one of his old shirts she'd borrowed as a joke a week ago, and it made his chest ache to see it now. "You're early," she said, surprised but smiling. "I brought something," he said, holding out the box. "What is it?" she asked. "Just something I made." She took it carefully, running her thumb over the carved letters. "It's beautiful, David, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said quietly, "you've both given me more than you know." Before she could answer, Sophie ran in, her pajamas covered in chocolate, and yelled, "Mr. David, we're making breakfast, Mom burned 1 pancake already." Emma rolled her eyes. "Thanks for that announcement." David laughed. "I can handle burned pancakes, they're the sign of a good morning." He joined them in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up, flipping pancakes with serious focus while Sophie acted as judge, taking 1 bite of each and saying, "Needs more syrup," until David jokingly handed her a spoonful straight from the bottle. By the time they sat down, the table was a mess of crumbs and laughter, and Emma shook her head smiling. "You two are a dangerous combination." "Correction," David said, "we're a great team." Sophie nodded excitedly. "Mom, we should open a restaurant." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what would we serve?" "Burned pancakes and bad dancing," Sophie said proudly. David almost choked on his coffee laughing. "That's a billion-dollar idea." After breakfast, while Sophie watched cartoons, David and Emma stood by the kitchen sink rinsing dishes together, and he reached for a plate at the same time she did and their hands touched. It was quick, but neither moved right away. "You're getting good at this," she said softly. "Cooking or being human again?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Both." He smiled, looking down at the soapy water. "You know, before all this, before you two, I thought my life was already over, not physically, but everything that mattered felt finished." Now he stopped, choosing his words carefully. "Now I wake up wanting to see what happens next." Emma looked at him for a long moment, her face hard to read. "You're dangerous when you talk like that, David." "Dangerous," he said with a small smile. She nodded. "Because I could start to believe it too." Before either could say more, Sophie came running in. "Can we go to the fair today? There's cotton candy and rides." Emma looked at David, who shrugged. "I'm in if you are." A few hours later, the three of them walked through the county fairgrounds, where the air was thick with the smell of popcorn and fried dough. Children were screaming with joy as the Ferris wheel spun slowly against the blue sky, and Sophie tugged on David's sleeve. "You have to win me a teddy bear." He smiled. "You're talking to a former champion of carnival games, Miss Mitchell." "Really?" she said, not believing him. "Absolutely," he said, taking the ring toss challenge, but after missing twice he finally landed one perfectly and won a small fluffy bear. Sophie jumped up and down cheering. "You did it." David bowed like royalty. "Never doubt the king." Emma laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible." As the afternoon went on, they rode the carousel together, shared lemonade, and watched fireworks start to burst above the fairground. At one point, while Sophie chased bubbles nearby, David and Emma stood shoulder to shoulder with their faces lit up by flickering light. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I know crowds and noise aren't really your thing." "I'd rather be here than anywhere else," he said honestly. She turned to look at him, her face soft. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," he said, then more quietly, "You and Sophie are the best thing that's happened to me in years." The fireworks cracked above them, casting silver light across her face, and Emma's lips parted slightly like she wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, a small simple gesture, but one that made the noise around them fade away. When Sophie came running back holding a half-melted ice cream cone, she noticed their joined hands and grinned. "See, you are a family now." Emma's cheeks turned red and she started to say something, but David only smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe she's right," he said softly. Later, when they dropped Sophie off at home and the night had grown quiet, Emma stayed beside his car with the street light shining in her hair, making her look almost golden. "She doesn't mean anything by it," Emma said softly, "she just likes the idea of belonging." "So do I," he said. There was a long pause, then she stepped closer. "David," she said with her voice shaking a little, "I don't know what this is becoming, but it feels good." He reached up, brushing a curl from her face. "It feels real." For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, then she leaned in and their lips met, gentle, uncertain, full of all the words neither of them had dared to say. When they finally pulled apart, she whispered, "You should go before I forget how complicated this is." He smiled. "Maybe some things aren't meant to be complicated." She shook her head but smiled back, a quiet understanding passing between them. As David drove home with the night still warm, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time: peace, not the shallow calm of being alone, but the deep steady rhythm of belonging. He knew nothing about the future, what the world would say, what challenges would come, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of what came next, because for once David Carter wasn't just living, he was loving again. The next morning sunlight spilled through the wide windows of David's lake house, the air was cool and still, and for the first time in years he woke without the weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. His thoughts drifted back to the night before, the fair, the fireworks, the warmth of Emma's lips against his, and it hadn't been planned, it had simply happened, yet even now the memory stirred something quiet and fierce inside him, something that felt a lot like joy. He sat up rubbing his face then laughed softly to himself. "You're in trouble, Carter," he said quietly. By mid-morning he was walking around his kitchen trying to focus on work, and his phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Good morning, hope you slept well. Sophie says you owe her another dance practice, she's been twirling since sunrise." David smiled and typed back. "Tell her I'm preparing my champion moves, and tell her mom I hope she's okay after winning all those stuffed animals yesterday." Emma's reply came quickly. "I'm fine, my daughter now owns enough toys to start a zoo, we might need help." He laughed out loud, feeling lighter than he had in years. That afternoon he drove to the hospital to surprise them, and Sophie's art class had just finished. She came running the second she saw him waving a paintbrush. "Mr. David, we made superhero masks." He bent down. "And which one's yours?" She held up a purple paper mask with sparkly edges. "This one's mine and this one's yours." He looked at the second mask, blue with gold stars. "You made me one." "Of course, you're my superhero," she said simply, like that was the most obvious truth in the world. Emma appeared behind her, still in her nurse uniform with her hair pulled back and her eyes tired but soft. "She's been working on those for hours." David smiled. "I can see the hard work." Sophie grinned proudly. "You have to wear it, Mr. David, right now." He laughed but listened, putting the elastic band around his head, and Emma covered her mouth trying not to laugh. "You look very heroic." "Careful," he said, "flattery will get you pancakes." Sophie clapped her hands. "Yes." Emma shook her head. "You're both impossible." They walked to the hospital garden afterward, the one David's donation had quietly helped fix up, and children played under the shade of big trees while nurses sat nearby finally taking a breath between shifts. Emma led them to a bench near the fountain. "You know," she said softly watching the kids run, "this garden used to be empty, just weeds and rocks, now look at it." David followed her eyes. "It's beautiful, but it's not just because of money, it's because of people like you." She looked at him, her voice thoughtful. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," he said. "I spent half my life building things that never filled the quiet, turns out all I needed was to build something that mattered." Emma smiled faintly, brushing hair from her face. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I do." Their eyes met again and for a long moment neither looked away, then Sophie broke the silence by running up with 2 paper cups of lemonade from a nearby stand. "Here, one for you, one for Mom." David took his cup with a grin. "Thank you, partner." She nodded proudly. "We're the best team ever." Emma smiled down at her daughter, then at David. "Yes," she said softly, "we really are." The rest of the afternoon passed in easy laughter as David helped Sophie build paper boats to float in the fountain, pretending each one was on a mission of justice, and Emma sat nearby watching them, her heart full but also worried because the truth was simple, she was falling for him and it scared her. Later, when Sophie was taken to a friend's house for a sleepover, Emma and David stayed outside the hospital as the sun was setting with gold light brushing across their faces, and the quiet between them felt different now, charged but calm. "You didn't have to come today," she said softly. "I wanted to," he replied. "You keep saying that," she said quietly, "like wanting something makes it easy." He studied her face. "Doesn't it?" She shook her head slowly. "You don't understand, David, my world, it's small, simple, held together by work and routine, yours is," she gestured vaguely searching for the words, louder, brighter, "and when those worlds mix someone usually gets hurt." He stepped closer. "Then I'll be careful, I'll protect it, you, Sophie, all of it." She looked at him, torn between hope and fear. "You can't protect us from what people will say." "Let them talk," he said, "I'm done living for them." She hesitated, her voice shaking. "And if it all falls apart?" He reached out gently, touching her hand. "Then we rebuild it together." The honesty in his voice stopped her, and she wanted to believe him, she really did, but life had taught her that happiness always came with a price. She sighed softly. "You're stubborn, relentlessly. And you're not going to walk away, are you?" He smiled. "Not a chance." For a while they just stood there, the air thick with the smell of flowers and warm road, then Emma stepped closer, resting her head lightly against his chest. "You're going to make my life very complicated," she whispered. He smiled into her hair. "Good, maybe it's time for complicated to mean something good." When he drove her home later they didn't say much, but as she got out of the car Emma turned back with her hand resting briefly on the window frame. "David," she said softly, "you've changed since the night of that dance." He smiled. "Because of a little girl who saw me better than anyone else ever did." Emma nodded. "And maybe because you let her mother see you too." As she walked away David sat still for a moment watching her disappear into the glow of the porch light, and he felt both grounded and floating, alive in a way that scared him but in the best possible way. Inside his jacket pocket the crumpled superhero mask Sophie had made earlier brushed against his hand, and he pulled it out smiling at the sparkly stars. "Superheroes don't always wear capes," he whispered to himself. That night when he wrote in his notebook he didn't start with a date, he simply wrote, "Maybe love doesn't save us, maybe it just reminds us we're worth saving." 3 weeks later the world David thought he'd left behind came knocking, and the morning began with his phone buzzing endlessly on the counter. He ignored it at first, focused on his coffee and the sound of birds in the trees outside, but when the calls kept coming one after another he finally sighed and picked it up. It was his assistant and her voice carried the tight edge of bad news. "Sir, we have a situation." David's stomach sank. "What kind of situation?" "There's an article in the newspaper, it's spreading fast." He closed his eyes. "Tell me." "They published photos, ones of you at the fair, you, Emma and the little girl. They're saying the rich man turned hermit has been spotted with a nurse from the city, they're spinning it like some fairy tale gone wrong." He felt his jaw tighten. "What else?" "They're questioning her background, sir, they're saying she's after your money, that's enough," he said sharply, and his assistant stopped. "I'm sorry Mr. Carter but it's everywhere, the people from your company are already calling, they're worried about how it looks." David ended the call without another word and stood still staring at the silent phone, anger and disbelief rising like a storm. By noon it was worse, news shows, gossip websites, social media, all feeding on the same story, the billionaire and the nurse, and they guessed about Emma's reasons, about Sophie's father, about the mystery romance that had gotten America's attention. David turned off the television, his chest burning. "They don't even know her," he said to himself. He tried calling Emma but the call went straight to voicemail, then again, and by evening panic began to settle in. He drove straight to her apartment and the front door light was off. He knocked but no answer, he knocked again harder, and after what felt like hours the door opened just a crack. Emma stood there, her face pale, her eyes tired and guarded. "Emma," he said with relief flooding through him, "thank God I was worried." She looked at him for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Inside the apartment was dim, the television was muted but headlines still scrolled across the screen, David Carter's secret romance, who is the woman behind the billionaire, and Sophie wasn't there. "Where is she?" David asked. "Staying with my friend tonight," Emma said quietly, "I didn't want her seeing any of this." David let out a breath, his voice tight. "I'm so sorry, I should have seen this coming." Emma shook her head. "Don't, this isn't your fault." "Yes it is, I should have protected you both, I should have." "You couldn't have," she interrupted, her tone calm but shaking. "David, this is what I was afraid of, you live in a world where privacy doesn't exist. I knew they'd come for you but I didn't think they'd come for us." He stepped closer. "Then let me fix it, I'll call my lawyers, my team, they'll make it stop." Emma looked up at him, her face soft but sad. "You can't make gossip stop, you can't erase whispers, and I won't let Sophie grow up being someone's headline," and her voice broke on that last word. David felt something inside him break. "I'll make a statement," he said quickly, "I'll tell them the truth, that you didn't ask for any of this, that you're the best person I've ever known." She shook her head. That'll only make it worse. They'll say you're covering for me, they'll twist everything. David ran a hand through his hair, walking back and forth. So what do you want me to do? Walk away, pretend you don't matter? She swallowed hard. No, but maybe we need space until this calms down. The words hit him like a punch. Space. I can't have reporters outside my door, she said with her voice shaking. I can't have strangers taking pictures of my daughter, she's just a little girl, David. He stepped closer, his voice low and breaking. Emma, please don't push me away because the world can't mind its business. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm not pushing you away, I'm trying to protect what's left of our peace. For a moment neither spoke, and the hum of the muted television filled the silence like a ghost. Finally Emma whispered, you told me once that love doesn't erase pain, it reminds us we're worth saving. Maybe right now saving her means stepping back. Jonathan felt his throat tighten. And what about us? She looked at him and for the first time her voice broke. Maybe we're what gets saved later. He stood there silent with his hands tight at his sides, and there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make it harder, so he nodded slowly with his eyes burning. I'll wait, he said softly, for as long as it takes. Emma nodded with tears finally spilling. I know you will. When he stepped out into the night the air was heavy with humidity and heartbreak, and cameras flashed from across the street with reporters waiting and camera lenses shining like eyes in the dark. David didn't speak to them, he just walked past, got into his car and drove until the lights of the city faded behind him. At the lake house he sat on the porch, the same porch where Sophie had once danced barefoot under the stars, and he took out the folded paper letter she'd written him weeks ago, the one with the purple crayon hearts. You fixed our hearts a little bit. He ran his thumb over the words and whispered, not yet kid, not yet. The moon hung low over the lake with its reflection shaking across the water, and for the first time in months David felt the weight of loneliness again, not because he was alone but because he'd finally found something worth losing. The days that followed unfolded like slow-moving shadows, and David tried to bury himself in work, but every phone call, every meeting, every polite smile from someone he worked with only reminded him of what he'd lost. The world knew his name again on websites, talk shows, online debates, but never for the reasons that mattered, and they didn't talk about the little girl who taught him to dance or the woman who reminded him how to feel, they talked about the scandal. He stayed mostly at the lake house, disconnected from everything but silence, and even his assistant who had worked for him for 10 years didn't dare press too hard. She dropped off folders, spoke in careful tones and avoided the question in her eyes, are you okay, sir? He wasn't, and every night he reread Sophie's letter until he knew every curve of every word. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and hear her voice, bright, innocent, full of belief, you fixed our hearts a little bit, and those words were now his anchor. By the third week the headlines began to fade as a new celebrity scandal replaced his name and reporters moved on, but Emma didn't call. She hadn't answered his messages though she'd sent one brief text 10 days earlier. We're okay, Sophie's fine, please take care of yourself. He had replied instantly, I miss you both, and there had been no response until one Saturday morning. He was standing on the porch with a mug in hand watching the mist drift over the lake when a small figure appeared on the path leading to the house, and at first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but then he heard it, light footsteps and then a voice that pierced the quiet. Mr. David. He set the mug down with his heart racing, and Sophie came running toward him wearing her favorite purple jacket with her curls bouncing and her small backpack thumping against her side. Behind her a car waited at the end of the drive and Emma stood by it with her face hard to read. Sophie, David said, stepping forward with disbelief and joy tangled in his voice, what are you doing here? She threw her arms around his waist. I told Mom I wanted to see you and she said we could come for a little while. Jonathan bent down hugging her tightly. You have no idea how much I missed you. She looked up at him seriously. Mom said people were mean to you on TV. He smiled faintly. They were mean to all of us, but it's okay now. Mom said we have to be strong, Sophie continued, and she said sometimes love has to hide until it's safe. David felt his throat tighten. Your mom's a very wise woman. Emma walked up slowly as the breeze lifted her hair and she stopped a few feet away. I thought maybe, she began hesitating, maybe we could talk. He nodded, barely trusting his voice. I'd like that. Sophie skipped down to the dock, humming to herself, leaving them in the soft quiet of the porch, and Emma stood with her arms folded and her eyes fixed on the lake. She wouldn't stop asking, she said. Every night she asked when she'd see you again. I kept saying soon, but she didn't believe me anymore. Then I owe her one big hug, David said gently. Emma smiled faintly but didn't look at him. You shouldn't have had to go through that storm, David. I hate that it hurt you. It hurt because I couldn't reach you, he said quietly, not the reporters, not the rumors, just the silence. Emma let out a breath, closing her eyes for a moment. I needed space, I needed to make sure the noise didn't swallow us whole. And now, he asked carefully. She finally turned to face him. Now the world's moved on, but I haven't stopped thinking about you. Their eyes met, steady, searching, full of the words they hadn't been able to say for weeks. You told me once that you'd wait, she whispered. I am waiting, he said softly, but you're here now. Emma smiled, small and unsure. For today, for Sophie. David nodded. That's enough. They sat on the porch steps side by side, watching Sophie feed breadcrumbs to the ducks, and the lake sparkled under the late morning light, calm and forgiving. After a long silence, Emma spoke again. When the article came out, people from the hospital whispered and some looked at me differently. I was angry and embarrassed, but then one of the older patients said something I can't forget. David looked at her. What did she say? She said, if they're talking it means you're living, let them. He smiled. Smart woman. She reminded me that shame only works if you accept it, and I realized I wasn't ashamed of you or us. He turned fully toward her now. Then what are we waiting for? Emma hesitated. I don't want to build something that breaks under pressure. David reached for her hand, his voice steady. Then we build it differently this time, no headlines, no grand gestures, just small moments that are ours. Her hand shook in his, but she didn't pull away. You really think that's enough? He smiled. It's how all good things begin. Sophie turned with her voice carrying from the dock. Mom, Mr. David, come dance with me. They both laughed, looking at each other. Do we dare? Emma teased. I'd say it's tradition, David said, standing and offering his hand. They walked down to the dock, the same weathered boards that had once held their laughter months ago, and Sophie's tiny speaker sat beside her backpack, already playing that happy song. The three of them began to move together under the open sky, with Sophie in the middle holding their hands, and David stumbled once, making her giggle. Still bad at it, Sophie said, grinning. Some things never change, Emma said, smiling. Jonathan laughed. Maybe not, but some things are worth stumbling for. As the song faded, he looked at them both, Sophie glowing with joy and Emma's eyes soft and alive, and felt something solid settle inside him. The storm had passed and the world could whisper all it wanted, but what mattered was here, a child's laughter, a woman's quiet strength, and a man learning how to love again, one clumsy step at a time. When Emma and Sophie drove away that evening, David stood on the dock long after their car disappeared, and the air was still golden with sunset. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Sophie's letter, the edges worn from being unfolded so many times, and he read it once more, then whispered to the fading light, "You were right, kid, we fixed our hearts a little bit." A month later, summer leaned into its warmest stretch. And the lake sparkled beneath a haze of sunlight, and the rhythm of life had softened into something almost ordinary. David no longer woke to headlines or phone calls from nervous investors, and instead his mornings were filled with simpler things: coffee, silence, and the faint laughter of Sophie echoing through his memory. He'd started visiting the hospital again, not as a donor or figure of interest but as a volunteer, and he repaired broken toys, fixed light fixtures, read stories to the children in the recovery area, and no one cared who he was there. He was just Mr. David with the funny voice, the man who read books like they were plays. Emma noticed the change right away, and whenever she saw him moving quietly through the halls, chatting with the patients or holding a cup of burnt hospital coffee like it was fine tea, she felt her chest tighten. She had tried in the weeks after the scandal to convince herself that distance was safer, but safety, she realized, had never felt this lonely. It was on a Thursday afternoon when fate or something kinder decided to test the fragile peace they had built, and Emma was ending her shift when she heard the noise, raised voices near the main lobby. She hurried over to find a familiar reporter standing with a camera crew, the same one who'd broken the story months ago, and David was there too, dressed in his volunteer clothes, calm but firm. "I'm not doing this again," he was saying. "Please leave, this is a hospital, not a headline." "Mr. Carter, just a quick comment," the reporter pressed. "People want to know, are you and Nurse Mitchell still seeing each other? Was it all just a charitable act?" Emma froze with her heart beating fast, and David's jaw tightened. "You don't get to question what's real just because it doesn't fit your story." "Then tell us what is real," the reporter challenged with the microphone pushed forward. "Are you in love with her?" The question hit the air like a stone breaking glass, and the lobby went still. Nurses, patients, and even the person at the desk stopped what they were doing, and Emma's breath caught. David could have walked away, he could have smiled politely, said something vague and gone back to hiding, but something in him refused to live half-truths anymore. He looked straight into the camera, his voice steady but filled with quiet fire. "Yes," he said simply, "I love her." A whisper rippled through the room and the reporter blinked, startled by the bluntness. "So you admit?" "I don't admit anything," David interrupted. "I declare it. I love her, not because she's some story to tell, but because she saw me when no one else did. She and her daughter gave me back a piece of myself I thought was gone forever, and if the price of that is gossip or judgment, I'll pay it gladly." For a long moment no one spoke, and even the cameras seemed to stop. Then before anyone could say more, Emma stepped forward. Her hands shook but her voice was clear. "Enough," she said, "this is a hospital, you're disturbing patients, leave." The crew moved awkwardly back as security came closer, and David turned to her with his face uncertain, half apology, half relief. "I didn't mean to," he started. "I know," she said softly, "but you did." He let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "I just couldn't let them make you small, not again." She looked at him with her eyes softening despite herself. "You really don't make anything easy, do you?" "Would you love me if I did?" he asked with a slight smile. Emma let out a shaky laugh, the tension breaking. "You're impossible." "Persistent," he corrected. "There's a difference." That night, after the hospital quieted and the children drifted to sleep, Emma found him in the garden, the same one where they'd once talked about rebuilding, and the soft glow of the lamppost cast light around him. "You should be home," she said, stepping closer. He looked up, smiling faintly. "Couldn't sleep. I think I set a record for most awkward public announcement in the state." "You also gave the nurses something to talk about for weeks," she teased. He laughed. "Good, maybe it'll replace the gossip." For a moment they stood in comfortable silence with the hum of crickets filling the air, then Emma spoke quietly. "Why did you say it like that, so boldly?" He met her eyes. "Because I meant it, and because I was tired of hiding something good just to keep the world comfortable." Her voice softened. "You really love me, don't you?" David smiled, the kind that reached his eyes completely. Emma took a slow breath. "Then I guess it's time I stop running from that." She stepped closer, close enough to feel his breath, and rested her forehead against his chest. "You make me believe again," she whispered. He wrapped his arms around her gently. "That's all I ever wanted." Under the quiet hum of the garden lights they stood there, two people who had learned to love after loss, who had survived criticism and found grace. After a while Emma tilted her head up and smiled. "Sophie's going to be thrilled." Jonathan laughed softly. "She'll say she told us so." "She'll want another dance," Emma said. "Then we'll give her one," he replied. "We'll dance until people forget the story and remember the feeling." When they separated later that night, David walked her to her car, and she stopped before getting in. "You know, you didn't have to prove anything today." He smiled. "I wasn't proving, I was telling the truth." As she drove away, David stood in the glow of the hospital's entrance, feeling the weight of the past months lift like mist over the lake, and for the first time in years he wasn't just surviving the world, he was living in it fully and without apology, and somewhere deep down he knew that whatever came next, praise, judgment, silence, it didn't matter because he'd already won back the only thing that mattered, her. The story didn't quiet down after David's public announcement, it grew, changed and strangely softened, and the headlines that once made fun of him began to shift in tone. The same media that had painted him as a scandal now called him the billionaire who spoke from the heart, and for weeks strangers sent letters to the hospital, some judgmental but many kind. Women who'd lost their husbands wrote that his words made them believe in love again, and fathers sent drawings from their children thanking Mr. David for proving that people could still be good. David didn't care about the noise anymore because he only cared about how life had begun to feel normal again, and each morning he stopped by the hospital garden before work, often finding Emma there watering the flowers. They'd talk briefly about her patients, about his foundation's latest projects, about Sophie's endless energy, and their words weren't romantic but the quiet between them carried all the tenderness they needed. By August his company had stabilized under a new board and David refused to take back full control because he'd built enough businesses for a lifetime, and now he focused on what he called real work, paying for scholarships, rebuilding playgrounds and donating medical supplies to hospitals like Emma's. But what mattered most were the weekends because those belonged to them, and Sophie declared them family adventure days though their adventures were usually simple, picnics by the lake, movie nights or baking attempts that ended with flower clouds and laughter. David had even bought a small wooden rowboat which he painted sky blue, and one Sunday afternoon as bugs buzzed and the air shimmered with summer heat, the three of them sat in that rowboat drifting slowly in the middle of the lake. Sophie dangled her fingers in the water giggling every time a fish came near the surface. "Mr. David," she said suddenly, "do you believe in forever?" David smiled. "That's a big question for such a small captain." "I do," Sophie said confidently. "Mom says forever means we keep loving people even when they're not near, like Dad." Emma looked up from her seat with her eyes soft. "That's right, sweetheart." Sophie tilted her head. "Then you and Mom love each other forever too, right?" Emma's breath caught and David looked at her with his heart warm and aching all at once. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think we do." Sophie grinned satisfied and leaned over the side to watch the ripples spread. Later as the sun began to dip low painting the lake gold, Emma rested her head against David's shoulder. "She's braver than I ever was," she said quietly. "You're wrong," he said, "she gets it from you." Emma laughed softly. "From you too maybe." They rowed back to the dock in silence with the sound of the oars steady and soft, and when they reached the shore David helped Emma out first then lifted Sophie into his arms. She had already begun to yawn, the kind of sleepy happiness that only children knew. Back at the cabin David tucked Sophie into the small guest bed they now called her room, and she mumbled something half awake, "Don't forget to dance tomorrow," and drifted into dreams. Emma watched from the doorway with her face tender. "She feels safe here," she said quietly. "She is safe here," David replied. When he turned to her their eyes met and no words were needed, and he stepped closer brushing a strand of hair behind her ear with his thumb staying at her jawline. She closed her eyes at the touch leaning into it. "David," she whispered, "I was scared for so long, scared that if I let myself love again I'd lose it, that life would take it away like it always does." He shook his head gently. "Love doesn't promise safety, Emma, it promises truth, and truth is always worth the risk." She opened her eyes with the reflection of the lamplight shining like tiny stars. "Then I'm done being afraid." And this time when they kissed there was no hesitation, only the steady rhythm of two people who had earned their peace. Later they sat on the porch with glasses of juice, the crickets singing their endless summer song, and the lake sparkled under the moon, the same lake that had once been his prison of grief, and now it was home. "Do you ever think about the first night?" Emma asked softly, "the dance?" David smiled. "Every day, that tiny voice asking me to be her dance partner." Emma chuckled. "She changed everything with 6 words." He looked out over the water. "She saved me with 6 words." They sat in silence for a while watching the moon's reflection shake across the surface, then Emma spoke again, her voice quiet and sure. "You know she told me she wants to write another letter, she said she has more things to thank you for." David smiled. "Then I'll make sure she never runs out of reasons." The night stretched long and gentle, wrapping around them like a promise, and the air smelled of pine trees and lake water and something new, something that felt like belonging. When Emma finally stood to go inside she looked back at him and whispered, "You're home now, David, you know that right?" He nodded slowly. "I think I finally do." The next morning as sunlight touched the still water, David opened his notebook and wrote his final entry beneath months of messy handwriting. "Love found me again, not in the office, not in the headlines, but in a child's laughter and a woman's quiet courage. If the world is kind, it will remember us not for what we had but for what we gave. He set the pen down smiling, and through the open window he heard Sophie's sleepy voice call out, "Mr. David, breakfast," followed by Emma's laughter. And as he stood up from his chair with the sound of their voices filling the house, David Carter realized he had everything he'd ever needed. It was early fall when the air around the lake began to change, that gentle coolness that hinted at colder days and quieter nights, and the trees surrounding David's cabin had started to turn with their leaves shifting from green to shades of orange and brown. The lake reflected it all like a painting, a world changing yet somehow still at peace, and David had started calling this season the in-between, not summer, not winter, but something tender that held traces of both, just like his own life now. He stood on the porch that morning with coffee in hand watching as Emma and Sophie came up from the trail, and Sophie was holding a basket almost too big for her, its edge full of apples they'd picked from a nearby orchard. Emma followed close behind with her hair caught up in the cool wind and her laughter rolling over the water like a song he never wanted to forget. "Delivery for the king of the lake," Sophie shouted holding up the basket proudly. David grinned. "I accept this royal gift, but I must warn you, payment is required." Sophie gasped dramatically. "Payment?" He nodded. "Yes, one dance after breakfast." "Deal," she said without waiting. Emma reached the porch shaking her head with pretend disapproval. "You know you've turned her into a little negotiator." "Good," David said, "she'll need that someday." Vanessa smiled. "She gets that from me." He leaned in with his voice low and teasing. "And the stubbornness too, I assume." She raised an eyebrow. "Absolutely." He laughed taking the basket from Sophie. "You two are impossible." After breakfast, pancakes and fried apples sweet and buttery, the three of them went out to the yard where the sun was warm but soft, filtered through the canopy of orange leaves. Sophie connected her small speaker again and that happy song began to play with the notes carrying across the lake. As they danced, David realized how far they'd come from that first awkward evening in the school gym, and back then he had been a man holding sadness like armor, but now he was simply a man holding on to the people who made him feel alive. When the song ended, Sophie laughed and clapped her hands. "We're perfect now," she declared. Emma bent down to fix the little bow in her daughter's hair. "We're happy," she said softly. That afternoon, while Sophie napped inside with her stuffed animals, Emma and David sat on the porch again watching the wind scatter leaves across the lake surface. "Do you ever think about how strange this all is?" she asked quietly. He smiled. "All the time, I mean you, the billionaire who used to live in tall buildings and private jets, and me, just a nurse trying to keep the lights on. It's like we came from different worlds." David turned toward her with his eyes steady. "Maybe, but the thing about worlds is they're only far apart if you stop walking." Emma smiled faintly. "You always have an answer for everything, don't you?" "Only for the things that matter." She reached out, brushing her hand over his. "You really think this will last, that we can just stay like this?" He took a deep breath with his eyes drifting toward the lake. "I used to think forever meant something unbreakable, a promise that couldn't bend or change, but now I think forever just means we keep showing up, even when it's hard, even when it rains." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "That sounds like something Sophie would say." "She's the wisest one of us all," he said with a quiet laugh. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing and letting the quiet speak for them, and a group of geese crossed the sky with their calls echoing over the lake. Somewhere in the house Sophie stirred, talking in her sleep, and Emma looked up. "You know, she told me something the other night." "What?" David asked. "She said Mr. David doesn't just fix things, Mom, he listens until they work again." David chuckled softly with emotion thick in his voice. "That kid's going to be a writer." "She already is," Emma said. As the sun began to dip lower, David stood and reached for Emma's hand. "Come on." "Where are we going?" she asked. "You'll see." He led her down the dock with the wooden boards creaking under their steps, and when they reached the end he stopped and pointed toward the opposite shore. "I bought that land," he said. Emma blinked. "What? Why?" He smiled. "Because the community's been asking for a free clinic and I thought maybe you'd like to run it." She stared at him stunned. David, that's incredible, but you didn't have to. I wanted to, he said simply, not for me, for you, for the families who can't afford care, for the mothers who sit awake at night wondering how to help their kids. Emma's eyes filled with tears. You really meant it when you said you'd build things that mattered. He nodded. You taught me how. She threw her arms around him then, the kind of hug that said everything words couldn't. You have no idea what this means. Maybe I do, he whispered. You and Sophie gave me my life back, let me give something back to the world. She looked up at him smiling through tears. You're going to make me cry. He grinned softly. That's fair, you've made me do it enough times. When they walked back toward the cabin, the sky was streaked with gold and purple, and Sophie came running out holding her little speaker again. Mom, Mr. David, one more song. Emma laughed. You never get tired of dancing, do you? Never, Sophie said proudly, because dancing means you're not sad anymore. David bent down and lifted her up, spinning her once. You're absolutely right. And as the three of them twirled together under the orange light of early evening with their laughter rising over the water, David realized that his world, once built on money and power, had finally found its center in something far simpler, love in all its imperfect enduring grace. By the time October came, the lake had turned silver in the mornings with mist rising from the water like breath from an old dream, and the air carried that crisp scent of pine and change. David stood at the window of his cabin with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, watching the reflection of golden leaves drift across the surface, and inside the house was no longer quiet in the way it once had been. There were now traces of life everywhere, Sophie's jacket hanging by the door, one of Emma's coffee mugs on the counter, a few crayons rolling across the table, and he smiled at the mess because it was the kind of chaos he'd never realized he missed. In the months since the storm, everything had settled into something gentle and steady, and Emma had accepted his offer to run the new community clinic, and construction had begun on the far side of the lake. Each morning she drove over to check the progress with clipboard in hand, her professional focus somehow mixing perfectly with the soft kindness that made her who she was, and Sophie had started first grade and had quickly become the unofficial mayor of her classroom. She told anyone who would listen about Mr. David, the man who builds playgrounds and burns pancakes, and on weekends the three of them were inseparable. They went hiking through trails splashed with fall color, baked pies that never quite looked right but tasted perfect, and played board games that always ended with Sophie winning because, as Emma said, no one survives her charm attack. One Saturday morning Emma came in from her rounds at the clinic site with cheeks red from the chill, and David was in the kitchen with sleeves rolled up stirring something on the stove that smelled like cinnamon and mistakes. She laughed as soon as she saw him. Are you trying to set off the smoke alarm again? I'm expanding my cooking skills, he said with fake seriousness. Translation, you forgot to stir. He turned and handed her a spoon. Taste and tell me I'm wrong. She took a small bite, stopped and grinned. Okay, fine, it's good, you've officially learned to make oatmeal that doesn't taste like sadness. High praise from a nurse, he said, bowing dramatically. Before she could answer, Sophie came racing in with her backpack bouncing. Mom, Mr. David, guess what, my teacher says we can bring family to the Harvest Festival next week. David raised an eyebrow. And who counts as family? Sophie gave him a look only a 6-year-old could pull off. You do, obviously. Emma smiled at him softly over Sophie's head. Obviously. The following Friday the small town festival unfolded like something out of a dream, with hay rides, pumpkin pie and laughter that drifted through the cool air. Children ran between booths while parents huddled over hot cider, and David walked beside Emma and Sophie with one hand carrying a basket of caramel apples and the other slipping occasionally into Emma's. Hey Mr. David, Sophie said suddenly, can you win me that big teddy bear? He grinned. Oh, the giant pink one that looks like it eats smaller bears for breakfast, challenge accepted. It took him 6 tries at the ring toss and a great deal of good-natured teasing from Emma before he finally succeeded, and when the booth worker handed Sophie the massive toy she squealed and threw her arms around David's waist. You're the best, she said. Mom, look, now we have a family bear. Emma laughed with her eyes bright. Family bear, I like that. As the sun went down behind the trees, turning the sky a deep orange, the music started with an old country song played by a local band, and people began to dance in the open field with boots tapping against the dirt. Sophie tugged on David's sleeve. "Dance time." He smiled, setting down the caramel apples. "How could I forget?" He offered his hand, but Sophie pushed him gently toward Emma instead. "You and Mom should go first, I'll dance with the bear." Emma blinked in surprise. "What?" Sophie crossed her arms seriously. "It's your turn, I got to dance first." David chuckled. "The Queen has spoken." He held out his hand to Emma. "Your Majesty." She rolled her eyes but took his hand anyway. "Just this once," she said quietly. Anna played that happy song from her tiny speaker, and the familiar melody filled the field, and the music wasn't fancy, just a simple tune carried on a fiddle and guitar, but as they began to sway under the hanging lights the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. "I think she planned this," Emma said quietly. "She's a mastermind," David agreed. "I'm a little afraid of her." Emma laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "You know, you're actually getting better at this." "Miracles happen," he said. They moved slowly, comfortably, two people who had learned how to find rhythm again after losing it for so long, and around them the laughter of the crowd mixed with the scent of cider and fall leaves. When the song ended, Emma didn't step away right away, and she looked up at him with her eyes reflecting the soft light. "You were right," she said quietly. "About what?" "Forever doesn't mean perfect, it means we keep showing up." He smiled. "And you're still showing up." She brushed her thumb over his cheek. "Every day." Sophie ran up, then dragging the giant teddy bear behind her. "You two look happy," she said, grinning. "Can we get pie now?" David laughed, scooping her up. "Pie it is." They spent the rest of the evening eating pumpkin pie on a blanket near the fire, with Sophie curled against Emma's side and her eyes drooping as sparks floated into the cool night sky. David wrapped an arm around them both, with the heat from the fire warming his face and the sound of the crowd fading into a soft hum, and in that moment, watching the two people who had become his reason to breathe, David understood that happiness didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was as quiet as a child's sleepy sigh, as gentle as a hand resting in yours. When the festival ended, they walked back to the car under a sky full of stars, and Emma glanced over at him. "She's right, you know, about what, us, we're a family now." David smiled, slipping his fingers through hers. "The best kind, the kind we built ourselves." Winter came quietly that year, with the first frost painting the trees in soft silver, and the air grew still enough that even the lake seemed to breathe slower. Inside David's cabin, the warmth of the fireplace glowed across the wooden walls, casting a golden light that made the space feel more like home than it ever had before, and it was Christmas Eve. Emma was in the kitchen humming softly as she finished decorating cookies, while Sophie sat cross-legged near the fire with her little fingers carefully tying ribbons on presents, and David, no longer the lonely man who had once lived among empty rooms and silent memories, was helping hang the last ornaments on the small pine tree they had cut together the week before. Sophie looked up suddenly. "Mr. David," she said, "you forgot the star." He smiled. "That's your job, Captain." She jumped to her feet and climbed the small stool he'd set up for her, and Emma came over, wiping her hands on a towel. Together they lifted Sophie high enough to place the gold star on top, and when she did, she beamed as if she'd crowned the world itself. "There," she said proudly, "now it's perfect." Emma looked at David with her eyes soft. "It really is." Later that evening, after dinner and laughter and far too many cookies, they settled near the fire, and snowflakes had begun to fall outside, rare and brief in their area but magical all the same. David sat back with his arm around Emma's shoulders, watching Sophie build a tower of books and toys, and the quiet happiness of the moment filled him with something deeper than joy. It was peace. Emma leaned into him. "You know," she said softly, "a year ago I didn't even believe in this, in second chances, in love that doesn't hurt." He kissed the top of her head. "And now? Now I think maybe life doesn't give us second chances," she said, "it gives us new beginnings." David smiled. "You sound like someone who should be writing children's books." "I get my inspiration from a very persuasive 6-year-old. Sophie looked up from her tower. "Mom, Mr. David, can we open just one present tonight, please?" Emma sighed playfully. "Just one?" Sophie grinned and handed a small neatly wrapped box to David. "This one's for you." He raised an eyebrow. "From you?" "From me and Mom," she said proudly. He unwrapped it carefully and inside was a small snow globe. Within the glass stood a little house beside a lake with a man, a woman and a child holding hands under falling snow, and the base read in careful handwriting, "Our forever home." David's throat tightened and he looked at Emma, then at Sophie. This is beautiful." Sophie nodded. "It's us." Emma smiled softly. "She designed it and made me promise we'd give it to you tonight." David turned the globe slowly in his hands, watching the snow swirl around the tiny family. "I think it's the best gift I've ever received." Sophie leaned against his arm. "Now you have us forever." He swallowed hard with emotion filling every word. "I already did." Later, after Sophie had drifted off to sleep under her favorite blanket, David and Emma stepped outside where the snow had begun to stick, dusting the porch and the edge of the dock, and the lake reflected the moon like a sheet of silver glass. Emma crossed her arms against the cold. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. He nodded. "You can almost hear it breathe." She smiled. "I love it here." He said, "I know," then after a pause, "So do I." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box covered in soft fabric, and her breath caught as he opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, a single diamond set in a band of white gold. "David," she whispered. He took her hand gently with his voice low and steady. "Emma Mitchell, you and Sophie walked into my life when I thought I'd already lived all the chapters that mattered. You showed me that love isn't about being rescued, it's about being seen completely, and for the first time in years I want the rest of my story to have a purpose, and I want it to have you." Tears filled her eyes with her breath shaking in the cold air. "You don't have to." "I'm not doing this because I have to," he said softly, "I'm doing it because I can't imagine another sunrise without you in it." She looked at him for a long quiet moment, then nodded through her tears. "Yes." The word was small but it carried everything, the fear, the gratitude, the love they'd built piece by piece, and David slipped the ring onto her finger. She laughed softly, half crying, half shivering. "You're supposed to wait until after Christmas," she teased. He smiled, pulling her closer. "I've already waited long enough." They kissed under the falling snow, slow and certain, with the lake behind them reflecting the pale glow of the moon, and inside through the window the little snow globe sat on the table shining in the firelight with tiny flakes swirling endlessly around the miniature family inside, a quiet promise of love that had weathered everything. Later that night when David tucked Sophie in, she stirred and said sleepily, "Did Santa come yet?" "Not yet," he whispered, "but something better did." "What?" she asked drowsily. He smiled. "Forever." Sophie smiled in her sleep and David sat beside her for a long moment watching the firelight flicker against the walls, and outside the wind rustled through the trees. For the first time in his life David Carter truly understood what peace sounded like, and it wasn't silence, it was laughter in a warm house, the soft breath of a child, the heartbeat of someone who loved him, and that was enough to last a lifetime. The story of David, Emma and little Sophie reminds us that love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds, not through big gestures but through simple everyday kindness, and it teaches that second chances don't arrive wrapped in perfection, they come quietly in the laughter of a child or the courage to dance again after loss. True love isn't about wealth, status or control, it's about presence, forgiveness and the willingness to see people for who they truly are, and in the end the story shows that family is not always something we're born into, sometimes it's something we build with open hearts and gentle hands.